Starmer's in such a weak position, can't even allow the darling of the North, Andy Burnham, to even stand in the by-election.
I think it shows that all the Labour Party has now really is the politics of fear, and it's the politics of sort of phony anti-fascism, effectively. They're straightforwardly suggesting that Reform are a kind of extremist threat, and that says far more about them than it does about Reform or Matt Goodwin, to be perfectly frank.
They've accepted Robert Jenrick and Suella Braverman, who have both been serving ministers in government where Britain broke.
Hello and welcome back to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers. With me in the studio, we have Spike's editor, Tom Slater.
Hello.
And we are thrilled to be joined by extra special guest, Reem Ibrahim.
Hello.
You're at the IEA currently, but you're leaving very soon for pastures new at Reason.
I'm very sad to be leaving the UK and leaving London and leaving my lovely friends. I think this is the second to last podcast I'm doing before I leave.
Very exciting, very sad, bittersweet, but yeah.
Bittersweet. I'm getting out of socialist Britain, so it's fine. I'm self-deporting, is what's happening.
Excellent. Yeah, you're part of the wave, of part of that exodus. So we've got plenty to talk about today. We'll be discussing the Gorton and Denton by-election, the travails of poor old Andy Burnham, and Suella Braverman's defection. But before we get into all that, I just want to remind everyone that we are doing a January sale. So you have literally, I don't know when you're watching this, but you have hardly any time at all left to take advantage of this. It's £1 a month for the next 3 months to become a Spike supporter. Usually it's £5. It will revert to £5 after those first 3 months. But why not take advantage of it now? Test it out. You can access all of Spike's articles. You can access the Spike Podcast Unlocked, our extra special bonus pod, which you can watch after this. You can come to our events at a discounted rate. All kinds of great perks. So sign up now for £1 a month for the next 3 months at spiked-online.com/support. Take advantage of this offer before it goes. It's spiked-online.com/support. Okay, so the Gorton and Denton by-election is heating up. It has been a safe Labour seat for basically as long as anyone can remember, but it's looking to be pretty much a three-way race between the Labour Party, the Green Party and Reform, and we can get into some of the spicier elements of each of those parties in a bit. It was caused by Andrew Gwynn, the Labour MP, retiring on mental health grounds. People may remember he had a bit of a scandal with a WhatsApp group. We can also get into that. Andy Burnham was putting his hat in the ring to be a part of this race, but he was blocked. We'll talk about him later. But Tom, first of all, do you want to sketch out why this race, this by-election that in any normal year would have just been a shoe-in for the Labour Party, why it's so fascinating?
It's kind of like a microcosm of all of the big political rows in the country in some ways. So you've got what should be a safe Labour seat suddenly vacant and Labour Party failing to try and hold on to it. You've got a insurgent Reform Party who were trying to cause an upset with GB News' Matt Goodwin already making some waves there. And then, of course, you've got the Muslim vote endorsing the Green Party.
Yeah.
So all the different kind of trends and fault lines in our politics summed up all that. And also the fact, and the Tories are completely absent from the discussion as well, which is not unusual in that part of the world, but nevertheless is kind of the story of our time. As you say, there's so many different layers to it, but the fact that Labour certainly are worried about how this by-election is going to go, whether or not there's going to be a sort of repeat of what we saw in Caerphilly in that by-election for the Welsh Senedd seat, where they get squeezed from the left, squeezed from the right and end up being displaced. I think there's also going to be concerns amongst Reform that they would almost have their own Caerphilly moment there as well, which is to say they do make considerable gains, but because you have a vote kind of coalesce around keeping Reform out, that could punish them as well. So it's going to be a really interesting test case of essentially the Reform insurgency and how strong or otherwise it is, and also just how weak the Labour Party has become under this Labour government. And particularly because this by-election was caused by a scandal, yes, which I think a lot of people have forgotten about, but also the fact that before it, the big story was keeping Burnham off of the ballot because the Labour Party was terrified, or Keir Starmer was terrified of a leadership challenge, and also terrified, if we are to believe them, of having a by-election for, or having another election for the Manchester mayoralty, something that they shouldn't be worried about because that should again be locked down. So yes, the sort of story of our time in one by-election.
What's fascinating about this is that it really is, whatever decision that Starmer made about Burnham's standing when it comes to the NEC, they both presented him as a very, very weak character. Either it is that he didn't want to risk a leadership contest because his position is so weak within the party, he needed to consolidate his power. And he's basically bought himself perhaps a few months by blocking it. Or he didn't block it, and actually what actually occurred was they didn't want to spend any money on a mayoral election, the reasons that they are giving. They didn't want to spend money on the mayoral election, they didn't want to risk the by-election, it's just, to me, just does not make sense, because it was sort of either option that he had, and it was a pretty bad one. And I think what's fascinating about this is Burnham coming out now and saying, this is, I was appalled by this, it was hard to deal with, rather than just sort of keeping his mouth shut and plodding forward. So I think it's fascinating because Starmer's in such a weak position that you can't even allow the darling of the North, Andy Burnham, to even stand in the by-election. And the question about whether or not we'd actually win the by-election, I mean, 25%, I believe, of the constituency is Muslim, and a lot of those people are going to be voting for the Green Party. Andrew Gwynn was, I think, a pretty fantastic MP in that area. He was, he's a friend, I should say. I sort of got to know him when I was about, I think, 19, with the Friends of the British Overseas Territories charity. It's a little bit niche, but he was, his entire life spent in the Labour Party. And for him to then go from that to then effectively be kicked out of the party over what I can tell are a couple of jokes. Can we talk
in private WhatsApp?
There's another part, which is sort of the story what's
Reem must be cool about the story because he was in a group called Trigger Me Timbers.
Yep.
I don't know whether this came out last year or the year before.
Tremendous name.
And he was quite unkind about some of the local council members and some local constituents. I think the most memorable one was where he was talking about getting complaints from local constituents where he said, fuck your bin collections. You'll have croaked by the time of the local elections anyway. I don't need your vote. Which, it's not a nice thing for an MP to say about a member of the public, but he did say it in private.
And also, I'm sorry, I think it's really funny. Like, I want our politicians to have a bit of a sense of humour. And I just think it's so ridiculous that our expectations for MPs are effectively that they will never say a bad word, that they're completely astute and responsible individuals that could never do anything that perhaps might offend somebody. My God, as human beings, we can do things that are offensive. I have said significantly worse in private group chats. I'm sure that any of us that have grown up with social media can attest to that.
That's why I'm never going to stand for Bond.
It's just insane. I thought it was pretty funny.
You're absolutely right. I'm sure the man that Andrew Gwynn, the councillor that Andrew Gwynn referred to as Colin Cumface, would disagree with you.
Yeah. And that's his right.
But this is it. Can we not make jokes anymore?
No.
I do just think. At the time, I really think, oh my God, there has to be more to this, because did they really remove the whip for a couple of jokes? I think what happened is the timing of this, because the winter fuel payments had been announced. These are the U-turn and the winter fuel payments, and the idea, the kind of narrative that Labour were after the pensioners. You saw this. I was at Conservative Party conference, and it's just like the sort of the dredges of the Conservative Party, which is like people protecting the triple log, protect the pensioners. We saw this at the 2024 election, right? Those were the policies that they were announcing. It was effectively trying to win the votes of the very, very elderly. And those people are dying out, and that's why the Conservative Party, I think, are going to struggle in the future electorally. But what was interesting is the narrative at that time was Labour hate pensioners. And so when you've got these jokes in a private WhatsApp group, now we know what they really think, we know what they really believe about pensioners. And so they had to, I think, have a bit of a hard line.
But it has created this sort of, massive political crisis for Labour where, as we said, they could be beaten by Reform, could be beaten by the Greens. Clearly you can see in Labour's campaigning approach to this that Reform is who they're attacking the most. We saw that with the disinformation that they put out about Matt Goodwin, the candidate. I'm sure Matt Goodwin has said plenty of colourful things that could be brought up and aired in public, but they tried to imply when he was at the Conservative Party conference, he then appears at the Reform conference and says, well, this I'm so glad I'm not in Manchester anymore. Oh, whatever, slags off the crowd in Manchester. And the Labour Party tries to imply that he's talking about Mancunians. He's talking about the good people of
No, he's
Gorton
talking
and
about
Denton.
party
When he was talking
conference,
about
obviously.
he's
It's
talking
just
about
a
party
straightforward piece of disinformation, which is purposeful and completely outrageous. And I think it shows that all the Labour Party has now really is the politics of fear, is the politics of sort of phony anti-fascism, effectively. They're straightforwardly suggesting that Reform are a kind of extremist threat. And that says far more about them than it does about Reform or Matt Goodwin, to be perfectly frank. They have nothing left. And in a way, it's probably the best strategy they have at their disposal because they don't have a compelling message to take to the electorate. But I think it just shows the fundamental weakness. I suppose a question for Reform, though, is like, particularly in a seat which is potentially quite fertile territory for them, is particularly, as I understand it, the Denton end of Gorton and Denton is a sort of post-industrial white working class kind of area, sort of place that could lean quite closely to Reform. But there is a sizable Muslim population who, it seems like, are being encouraged by these sectarian groups to vote for the Green Party. And also there will be a fair amount of waverers who maybe will be put off by partly the kind of relentless smear campaign, but also potentially by a candidate in the form of Matt Goodwin, who's quite significantly to the right even of Nigel Farage on many cultural questions. So maybe that will be difficult in winning over the waverers if that's put under people's noses, particularly in such a unfair and misrepresented way. So it's very difficult on both sides.
I don't think the individual candidates really matter. I mean, Matt Goodwin won't like this, but I don't think it really sort of matters that it's him. I mean, I think what really matters
So
is...
say this stuff about anyone.
Yeah, exactly. Effectively, what might happen is you've got the left-wing vote being split by Labour and the Greens. And so I think Reform have a very, very good chance because the Conservatives are basically non-existent in Gorton and Denton. So I also remember that there was the boundary change. I mean, it used to be Denton and Reddish, I think, was Andrew Gwynn's constituency. And the boundary changes, I'm sure, have had an effect on where those particular groups are sitting. And the traditional sort of white working class, potentially Reform voters, perhaps actually sit more closely in the constituency. And so, I mean, I think it's fascinating, the sort of looking at Gorton and Denton in this by-election as a microcosm for the future. The Conservatives are nowhere to be seen, which is, of course, something that is always sort of the case in those particular areas. And I'd be interested to know how many of the Reform vote or potentially Reform voters at this by-election were former Conservative voters in 2019.
Yeah, that will definitely be interesting to shake out. We should talk briefly about how about the Muslim vote.
Yeah,
it's interesting that has the Green Party is now the vehicle for that. I mean, essentially
before they've even declared a candidate, because obviously there's rumours that Mohsin Ali, the deputy leader who shouts Allahu Akbar at counts, was going to be the candidate. But even before that, they came out and said we're backing the Green Party. They said we're not even going to back the Workers' Party. That we considered it. So that's really telling about how the Green Party really claiming their place in the sort of Islamo left alliance that previously the sort of more Corbynistas or your party might have spoiled to do so. And that's why all of this talk from the Labour side about how divisive and ugly and sinister Reform supposedly are. Far more sinister development here, if we're talking about British electoral politics, is this Muslim, or this attempt to kind of gin up kind of Muslim bloc voting, to appeal to the electorate purely on sectarian lines, to have organisations which are set up. Muslim Vote, interestingly, seems to operate in the UK, in Australia. It's a striking similar website, trying to appeal to voters not on the basis of the issues that affect all constituents
just
or in the
because
nation,
of their faith.
Just because of their faith. This is the divisive, concerning issue, and yet we're talking about comments that Matt Goodwin might have made in a feisty GB News debate. It's absurd, but that's all the Labour Party has.
And it's the proxy voting that I think is concerning. I mean, you have. I mean, this happens. This does happen in every party. I mean, I know that it happens in the Conservative Party because I know that people have asked, in the Conservative Party, have asked families to vote for the entire family, make sure you get all the votes in. Like, it happens all the time. I'm sure Labour do it too. But there is something very sinister about the wives of these people that are not really being given, the democratic right to vote because they are being, they're proxy voting. And there is something interesting about it where you've got, mass blocks of people that are being proxy voted as a result of this, and how that sways election. I mean, it is, I think, an increasing challenge, and it's increasingly becoming an issue, especially when you have large numbers of the same demographic in particular areas. They just kind of come together. I cannot for the life of me understand why Muslims would, I grew up in a Muslim family, why they would want to vote for the Green Party. I mean, it really is just the the Palestine-Gaza stuff, I think is all it is. I did BBC Any Questions in the constituency. I think this was last year. Yeah, I think it was last summer. And I remember almost all of the questions were, I think they picked about 4 or 5 questions about Gaza. And there was a woman crying in the audience. And it's just, I've never experienced it when you actually see these people, and we're in some community centre or library. It just makes people so extraordinarily passionate. But there is no passion for Iran or for, for Sudan or for any of the other humanitarian crises occurring in the world. Where there is passion is for Gaza, and specifically from Muslims that are living in this particular demographic.
And the Muslim Vote group put out a clip earlier this week. Partly they said, ironically, that the text on the X post says we're talking about local issues. Twice Gaza is mentioned, of course,
Gaza is
in
not
this
local.
long clip, and also there's been
Gaza
a
and Manchester.
ceasefire since October as well. Last week we spoke about Keir Starmer's outrageous giveaway of the Chagos Islands, but did you know that every time you go online, you're also giving a lot away without even realizing it? Every time you use the internet, you're advertising your location and all kinds of other personal information to the world. The good news is that protecting yourself has never been easier, thanks to our partners, Private Internet Access, or PIA for short. PIA is the VPN I use and trust whenever I'm accessing the internet. A VPN, or virtual private network, is an app that hides your IP address and safeguards your internet connection through an encrypted tunnel. Instead of revealing your personal information and location to the world, PIA lets you change your IP address to one of 91 countries. This also means you can gain access to websites and services that are only available in those locations. Did you know that streaming services like Netflix and Prime Video have huge catalogues of content, but you can only access a fraction of it from your own country? Using PIA to change your location opens up a whole new world of streaming. Paying for Netflix without using PIA is a bit like paying for front row seats at the cinema, but being forced to sit in the hallway. PIA is essential for keeping yourself safe online. It protects you from the prying eyes of hackers, internet service providers, and anyone else with an unhealthy interest in your personal information or online activity. Personally, I would never go online without it again. And because PIA is available for all platforms, I never need to worry about my safety or privacy. It works on Windows, Apple Macs, iPhones, Androids, and more. Even better, you only need one subscription to protect yourself across all the devices you own. So, sign up now to the world's most transparent VPN provider and take advantage of our special offer. Spike viewers and listeners can get 86% off a subscription to Private Internet Access. That's just £1.67 a month. And you'll also get an extra 4 months thrown in completely for free. To take advantage of this incredible deal, just go to piavpn.com/spiked. That's piavpn.com/spiked. Signing up is totally risk-free. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee and 24/7 customer support. You won't regret it. So sign up now at piavpn.com/spiked. We should move on to talk about poor old Andy Burnham. It's hard to count how many times he's tried and failed to, become Labour leader. Officially, failed twice into leadership elections. He's been talking, his ambitions have been seen pretty much from space, I think it's fair to say. A lot of strange, I think, hope within the Labour Party that Andy is the man to rescue them. I know that Keir Starmer's pretty useless, but I don't think Andy Burnham could turn things around.
That's the thing that's probably best. We've talked already about how weak blocking Andy Burnham made Keir Starmer look, although it would have made him made him weaker rather than just look weaker if Burnham had ended up in Parliament. But it's taken some of the focus off of Burnham, who it's a tribute to just how terrible the potential alternatives to Keir Starmer are that Andy Burnham has become the king over the water, as it were.
Yeah.
This is a guy who ran for the Labour leadership twice and lost in quite humiliating fashion. And the first time around because he wasn't really nowhere to be seen. Second time around because he loses by a landslide to Jeremy Corbyn. And ran a campaign which was mocked for how flip-floppy it was, how embarrassing it was. I'll never forget when he did an interview on Mumsnet, which is apparently part of the process these days. And I asked him what his favourite biscuit was, and he said like lager, chips and gravy, because he's so northern and so authentic.
The king of the north.
No, exactly. It was just
Down to him,
this guy was just a complete, clown as far as anyone was concerned. He's since had this glow up as the king of the north, also become more ostensibly sort of soft left and socialist in his politics. This is a guy, when he was Health Secretary, presided over the marketisation of the NHS and voted for the Iraq War. I mean, he's someone who spent more than 20 years in Westminster, first as a special advisor before becoming a minister in the Blair and Brown governments, and now has just been able to just pivot and pose as the great anti-establishment candidate. He's just Keir Starmer in a pair of jeans. Like, there's no real substance there at all.
I think he's worse. I think Burnham is worse. And the reason for this is, if you listen to his, I think it was his speech at the IFS on Tuesday last week, he's propagating some scary stuff. I mean, he's talking about business-friendly socialism, which is an oxymoron. There is nothing business-friendly about socialism. Completely untrue. But, all of this stuff about how I think we just need to ignore the bond market. Are you that fucking stupid? Like, are you actually that stupid?
I think that was part of the reason he kind of shamefacedly backed down last time.
Yeah,
that
it
comment
was,
went down.
And
mental.
The bond market's moved on the suggestion that he was going to...
Just made him look stupid.
Even the suggestion that Andy Burnham would stand in a by-election and perhaps even want to challenge Starmer had an effect on the markets. Because when the government borrow lots and lots of money and spend lots and lots of money, the bond markets matter. It's really, really matter.
But also this kind of business-friendly socialism or Manchesterism, it's also just sort of, it's really incoherent, like even on its own terms. I mean, Johnny Ball at Unheard's written some good stuff about this, but how it essentially comes down to like his sort of record in Manchester and the supposedly great insight is that, of course, we need to do work business, and there's a lot of development going on in Manchester, a lot of skyscrapers going up, and we've also set up a new bus network. Yeah. And so using an obscure bit of Theresa May era bus regulation law, he's presented this as if it's a model for the country. Like, it doesn't, there's not really a hell of a lot to it, as well as a bit of posturing against the market. Yeah. So the issue that confronts the Labour Party, Green Party to a certain extent, but the Labour Party, right, if we're talking about them, is that what is your sort of political economy in a time when, there are severe economic problems and a lot of constraints that didn't exist previously? Keir Starmer has decided just not to answer that question and just sort of wibble around. And Andy Burnham just seems to suggest that there is this sort of perfect mix, but he never really fills out any of the details. So it just shows that not only the dearth of candidates, which we've been talking about, but also the dearth of ideas. I mean, there was reports that Ed Miliband would be a potential chancellor, and that talks had been undergoing for that to happen.
Yeah.
Again,
God help us.
Two rejected Labour politicians just sort of floating back up to the top at the worst possible time as well.
Miliband in his first attempt at the
But this is it. It is literally I think Burnham represents the worst of politics. It is all about personality. It is all about, being the king of the north, and absolutely nothing to do with substantial policy. What are you going to do to fix the economic woes of this country? What are you going to do to make people's lives better? That doesn't matter. I mean, the bond market statement, I think, is just absolutely evidence that he has no idea what he's talking about. And I think that what's interesting about the development of, his speech at the IFS, talking about what that looks like and, why he wants his business-friendly socialism, which absolutely, you're right, Tom, has, no real substance to it. He's talking about mixed economy, public transport, and being pro-business. But what does that mean? Like, what are you actually doing to make people's lives better? And I think when it actually gets boiled down, if he was to, God help us, ever, God forbid, ever get anywhere near number 10, it's effectively going to be, pretty hard left stuff. I mean, we're talking probably about Corbynism, the return of Corbynism, but he's presented it in such a way that it doesn't sound as scary as Corbyn made it sound.
I don't think he's. I don't know. I don't think he's that passionate about anything.
He's very passionate about Andy Burnham.
He's passionate about Andy Burnham.
But I mean, that's what we'll end up with.
There's a bit of a cult of personality without a personality around him a little bit.
And it confirms that the soft left of the Labour Party, if we can call it that, is now running the show.
Yes.
And has won everyone's affections.
They're already running the show.
So whatever else you could say about them, this is a really uninterested, unintellectual, vibes-based section of the Labour Party. I hope I'm not being too unfair, but it is true. Like, this is just, we don't like the look of that welfare cut. Not sure about this. That's not why I got into the Labour Party to do. This is the extent of the thinking that goes on any particular issues.
I care about people.
Exactly.
But it's like, what is caring about millions of young people not being in work?
Yeah, exactly.
What is the sort of human compassionate element to this? I think the benefits example is so fascinating, Tom, because We're now in a situation where 1 in 4 people, 1 in 4 working age people are currently out of work. I mean, I know lots and lots of young people that have just graduated with fantastic degrees that are currently out of work because the jobs just simply don't exist. And quite frankly, if that's the state of the labour market, and you now have more and more young people are able to claim benefits rather than work and claim they've got anxiety or depression, there is nothing compassionate about this situation. If you really care about those people, you want the system to change. You do not want them to continue to be given money to stay at home and have no purpose in life. That is not compassionate. And it is this surface level thinking of, oh, well, I'm in the Labour Party because we care about people. It really, really, really angers me. This idea that everybody else, those on the right, those that are sort of supportive of reducing the size of the state, are not caring. That really annoys me. No, I care. I really care. I just have a different approach, and dare I say it, the correct approach.
But it also appeals almost entirely to the do-goody middle classes.
Yes,
there was a
does.
YouGov poll out last week that pointed out that if you look at the poorest in society, the 2 leading parties are Reform and the Conservatives.
Yeah.
Tells you everything.
Well, let's talk about Reform and the Conservatives as well, because Suella Braverman has become the latest high-profile defector. People remember her as the former Home Secretary. I mean, it shows really, I guess, where the momentum is going. You know, whatever you think about Suella, I mean, we've often said that she's probably more suited to punditry than hard politics. I mean, think of some of the quotes like "Guardian eating, tofu eating, woke karate" is the one that.
Well, I was going to suggest the reverse in that. So, because she's someone who's actually quite, accomplished in terms of academia and the law and what.
Or she'd like to be a pundit.
Yeah, no, exactly. Her foray is into sort of punchy tabloid journalism is where she falls flat, I think. But then, I mean, it's a really the attempts to sort of downplay this and to be like, oh, this is just, the Reform Party becoming the retirement home for busted flush Tory politicians is just cope, really, to a certain level. Like, it is just the Tory Party have been drained of their voters. They're now being drained of various very prominent serving MPs that they previously had, all while they're trying to make a pitch to the electorate as the party of the right. This is disastrous for them. And of course, the defection thing, particularly people who might have been involved in the Reform Party for a very long time, might make some of them uneasy because they think the last Conservative government messed things up so terribly. But it's also historically, defections from one party to another has always been a part of the insurgent party story. You know, when Labour was leapfrogging the Liberals in the early 20th century, it was almost like 50 prominent Liberal politicians made the move over. SDP in the 80s, it was something like 30 predominantly Labour, obviously, politicians moving over to that insurgent party. Which of the two is it going to be? Is it going to be, the SDP failing to break the mould, or is it going to be Labour pulling off that kind of seismic political realignment? That's the question with Reform. Is it going to fall short, or is it not? But yeah, the attempt to downplay the significance of this, I think, is absurd because it's so clear that it's not only bolstering to Reform's prospects, but also more indications that the Tory party are basically in a bit of a death spiral. They're now essentially having an internal conversation about whether or not they should be second fiddle to Reform or a less cringy version of the Lib Dems. That's a terrible position to be in.
I disagree with us slightly about the defections, only because I think that there is a question of whether or not Reform are accepting too many former Tories. And the reason for that is because Reform are presenting themselves as the anti-establishment party. And yet they've accepted Robert Jenrick and Suella Braverman, who have both been serving ministers in government where Britain broke. What really struck me was when Suella did this big speech and with the sort of rally with Reform and, announced her defection, she started by saying, Britain is broken. My first thought was, well, you were in government when Britain broke. So, the fact that Reform are accepting these people, I do think raises some eyebrows. And
there's been a bit of quality control in terms of the other ones as well. Like, I don't understand the Nadine Dorries and
I would say that's
God bless him, Jake Berry stuff.
Nadine Dorries.
Jake Berry was on
Jake
TV
Berry,
defending
fine.
net zero 5 minutes ago.
Exactly.
I mean, it's like really odd.
Nadine Dorries, I think, is the most sort of offensive defection in my view, because she literally is the architect of the Online Safety Act.
Yeah.
She was
Loves Boris Johnson.
Loves Boris Johnson. Loved the lockdowns. Loved all of the big government stuff. That the Conservatives really did harm this country government, and they were part of it. And Reform accepting these people, I do think personally, does make you raise some eyebrows and think, you know what, how anti-establishment are they?
No, I would say in fairness to Braverman and Jenrick, at least they have, I think, a relatively convincing story of why things didn't go well. whether it's the both of them blaming civil service or Rishi Sunak or whatever, I think they can make a good argument as to why they weren't able to achieve things in the Conservative Party. And, there's a sizable number of wets in the party as well. That is kind of where the centre of gravity is among the MPs.
So
whereas someone like Nadine Dorries, what is her excuse?
But what's going to change? Like this is my question. I think you're probably right. They both have compelling stories. But what's going to change? How can reform convince us that something is going to change that means that when they get into government, they will be able to achieve all of these things? Robert Jenrick and Suella Braverman, I believe, have both resigned from government due to them saying that,
Yeah, Jenrick resigned. Suella was sacked.
Or she's sacked. Okay. Well, they both left government, and partly they were saying things aren't working. The civil service are really difficult to deal with.
The tofu munching wokarati is stopping us again.
The tofu munching Gandhi reading wokarati. But what is going to change between now and where if reform go into government? How are they convincing us things are going to change? Or is what's going to happen, which is what I think is going to happen, that nothing will change? No. Reform, Farage and Number 10, they're going to say, oh, well, we wanted to do the tax cuts, but, pensioners, we've got to keep spending more. And that's honestly why I just think we're going down genuinely a path like a road to serfdom. We're going down perpetual decline here, because I'm not convinced that any of these people really have what it takes to do what needs to be done, because some of what needs to be done will be politically unpopular.
Yeah, and they've got to convince on the policy, which is only really now beginning in earnest. They put a lot more out in relation to the immigration question, but beyond that, people are still pretty in the dark about what's going to happen there. And I think they know that as well. I mean, many of the people behind the scenes have been brought in explicitly to fill that offer. Yeah. I think that's the area. The personalities, I think, are less important because of the fact that people who are either very switched onto politics or write about it or work in it or whatever, we focus on that endlessly. The thing about someone like even Robert Jenrick, no one knows who he is outside of SW1. So what most people will see is that reform are on the up, the Conservatives are on the way down. And I quite like what Nigel Farage is saying, if they're reform-minded. So I think it's also a reminder, we talked about this on when we were discussing the Jenrick defection, is that it's just a direction, it's a sign of the direction of travel.
Yeah.
British politics is shifting in a quite kind of tectonic way. The Tories are being lost in that. Labour is being humbled by that, and reform is on the rise. That's the story as much as anything.
So we're going to be talking a little bit more about the Tory death spiral and how they're probably going to make things even worse for themselves in Spiked Podcast Unlocked, which if you're a Spike supporter, you can watch that right now. Go to the website, log in, the video will be there. If you're not a Spike supporter, then sign up straight away. We've got that £1 per month deal. Do it now. At spiked-online.com/supporters, and then you can hear the rest of this conversation. Plus, as well as talking about the problem of the Tory wets, we'll be discussing fairy pronouns and the crisis of ICE in Minneapolis. So lots to get.
Big tonal shift there to be good, yeah.
But we aim to please all people and do all things. So thank you so much for watching the Spike podcast, and thanks to our friends at Private Internet Access for sponsoring us. Now's the time to take control of your digital life and get PIA for 86% off. Click the link in the description below or scan the QR code. And remember, if you're a Spike supporter, then this episode isn't over for you yet. You can now watch the Spike podcast Unlocked. Just go to the Spike website, log in, and you'll see it on the homepage. So join us there right now. See you in a bit. Thank you so much for watching the Spiked podcast. We'll be back at the same time next week. In the meantime, why not subscribe to Spike's YouTube channel and then click the bell so you're always alerted whenever there's some new content. Spiked is producing more videos than ever, from podcasts like this one to interviews to our series of polemics. You really, really don't want to miss out on it. Plus, to get your daily dose of Spiked, just go to spiked-online.com. That's our website at spiked-online.com.